The war arrived first as sound. The low growl of engines crossing the channel, the distant thump of bombs falling somewhere unseen. But for a few dozen men and women along Britain's southeastern coast, it arrived as something else. A flicker of light on a green glass screen. In the summer of 1940, the Royal Air Force was outnumbered, outgunned, and outspent. The Luftwaffe had 4 times as many aircraft, but Britain had one secret the Germans didn't understand. A chain of tall steel towers running from the Isle of Wight to the Firth of Forth. They called it Chain Home. To the untrained eye, it looked like a row of radio masts, useless and dull. To those who worked inside the small windowless huts beneath them, it was the eyes of a blind island. Flight Lieutenant Edward "Eddie" Palmer was 24. Before the war, he had been a physics student at Cambridge, fascinated by sound waves. Now he sat in a darkened room at the Bawdsey Chain Home Station, staring at a cathode ray tube. Each sweep of the radar beam painted a new pulse of light across the glass, faint arcs, fading as fast as they appeared. His hands rested lightly on the controls. His headphones crackled with static. Every few seconds, a voice from the next room called out a bearing, a range, a speed. Outside, the night air smelled of salt and ozone. Radar was still a new word, barely a decade old. Most of Britain didn't even know it existed. But inside these huts, young men and women, many barely out of school, were learning to read the invisible. Palmer once joked to a colleague, "We don't see the enemy, we feel him." And it wasn't far from the truth. By August 1940, the system stretched along the entire coast. Each station transmitted pulses of radio energy that bounced off aircraft and returned as blips on a screen. It wasn't perfect. It couldn't tell altitude or identify friend from foe. But it was enough to give the RAF's fighter command minutes of warning. Minutes that meant lives. Every report traveled from the radar huts to a filter room in Bentley Priory, where Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding and his staff coordinated the defense of the realm. Radar told them where to send their Spitfires and Hurricanes. The rest was up to courage and fuel. Palmer's station was one of the first to pick up incoming formations. Night after night, he watched dots appear, vanish, and reappear. An unending dance of ghosts. He never saw the men behind those blips, but he imagined them. Leather coats, cigarettes, oxygen masks, flying toward London. On September 7, 1940, everything changed. The Luftwaffe turned its full power on London. For 57 consecutive nights, bombs fell. Warehouses burned along the Thames. Thousands died. The radar network never slept. Even when bombs fell close enough to shake the walls, the operators stayed at their screens. Eddie Palmer worked 18-hour shifts, eyes aching, hands steady. He and his team tracked the waves of aircraft crossing the channel, called them in to fighter command, and listened to the frantic replies over the wireless. Bandits 20 miles out. Altitude 15,000. Scramble! Tangmere, scramble! Sometimes the fighters made it in time. Sometimes they didn't. Few knew their names. The newspapers celebrated the pilots, the few who fought in the skies. But behind every interception was a line of tired radar operators tracing echoes on glass. Their huts were secret, unmarked, often disguised as barns. Their uniforms carried no insignia. When they went home on leave, they told no one what they did. One operator later recalled, "We couldn't tell our parents we were saving London." Palmer didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as an engineer, a man trying to read the air. But on one night in November 1940, that skill would change everything. It was bitter cold on the Suffolk coast. Wind rattled the radar towers. Frost glazed the sand dunes. Inside the operations hut, the room glowed faintly green from the screens. Palmer rubbed his eyes. He had been on duty since noon. Outside, the hum of the generator was constant. At 10:15 p.m., the loudspeaker crackled. Routine calibration check complete. No contacts. He leaned back, lit a cigarette, and stared at the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere out there, he knew, the Luftwaffe was forming up again. Hundreds of bombers, waiting for the moon to rise. He had seen the pattern before. He could almost feel it coming. He turned back to the screen. A faint pulse blinked at the edge of range. Then another. Then 10 more. The operator beside him frowned. Could be weather? No, Palmer said. That's metal. He leaned closer, adjusting the dial. The blips were faint, but steady, moving fast, low, and silent. Not the usual path, not the usual altitude. Something about it was wrong. Palmer grabbed the phone to Fighter Command's filter room. Bawdsey to Bentley Priory. We have unidentified contacts. Grid 75, bearing east-northeast, speed 230. Looks like a low-level approach. The voice on the other end hesitated. Confirmed? Confirmed. And there's more coming behind. Them. That night would become one of the most important radar interceptions of the war. The night when a handful of operators along the coast spotted a low-flying Luftwaffe formation aiming not for London, but for Britain's southern airfields themselves, a strike that could have blinded the RAF. And only one man had noticed it early enough to stop it. The pulse flickered again, then again, stronger this time. Every few seconds, the phosphor trace swept the green circle of the radar scope, the echo glowing brighter as the aircraft formation came closer to the coast. Palmer's cigarette hung forgotten between his fingers. He leaned toward the tube, measuring distance with the edge of a ruler. 40 miles out, he said quietly. They're coming in low, below the normal scan range. The room seemed to hold its breath. Radar stations weren't built to spot targets that close to the sea. Surface reflections confused the returns. If he was wrong, it was weather. If he was right, it was an attack that could cripple Fighter Command. Give me a cross-check from High Street and Dunkirk stations, he ordered. Telephones clattered. Minutes passed, long, slow minutes filled with static. Then a voice came back from the next station south, reading same blips, heading west. Low altitude, multiple aircraft, estimate 20 plus. That was enough. Palmer grabbed the red handset that linked directly to Fighter Command's filter room at Bentley Priory. Bawdsey confirms large formation approaching south coast, likely under radar horizon. Recommend alert for Portsmouth sector and Thames estuary fields. The duty controller at Bentley hesitated, then said, You're the only one reporting this, Bawdsey. Are you certain? I can see them moving. If you wait for confirmation, you'll be hearing bombs. Far inland, in the big plotting hall at Bentley Priory, young WWII plotters stood around a huge map table. Colored markers showed known squadrons and confirmed raids. When Palmer's call came through, the controller turned to the plotting officer. Mark an unconfirmed raid south of Ipswich. Possible low-level incursion. Range? He says 40 miles in closing. A red counter slid across the table. Phones rang again. Other radar stations began to confirm the same faint echoes. The invisible picture resolved itself. A line of enemy bombers skimming the sea, using cloud and darkness as cover. They were heading not for London, but toward the chain-home masts themselves, the very eyes of Britain's defense. In the hut at Bawdsey, Palmer could feel the vibration of the wind against the tower outside. He adjusted the gain knob, tuned out surface clutter, and watched the blips move inland. 30 miles. 25. They're spreading, said the assistant. Probably splitting into attack wings, Palmer replied. Get that to command, now! Outside, the searchlights at nearby Felixstowe flickered uncertainly across low clouds. No one could see the raiders yet. Only the radar could. Palmer knew that in another 10 minutes they would be over the coast. At Tangmere and Biggin Hill, klaxons sounded. Pilots sprinted from dispersal huts. Engines roared awake. The chain of communication moved faster than it ever had. Radar to filter room, filter to sector, sector to fighter control. On his scope, Palmer saw new traces appear, thin and swift. Friendly fighters climbing to intercept. He felt a strange surge of pride. It was working. The system that most of Britain didn't even know existed was fighting its own invisible war. The phone on Palmer's desk buzzed again. Bentley Priory here. Your interceptors are airborne. Estimated enemy contact in 5 minutes. He stared at the glowing ring of the screen. Blips merged, twisted, disappeared, then reappeared in confused clusters. The echoes of fighters and bombers mixed together until the scope became a storm of light. They've met them, he said softly. For 20 minutes the pattern convulsed. One by one the stronger signals broke apart. Others turned back toward the sea. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the screen cleared. "All echoes moving east," reported the assistant. "They're retreating." At dawn, reports filtered in. 2 radar towers near Dover damaged but still standing. Several Luftwaffe bombers shot down before reaching the coast. No major stations lost. Fighter Command's network remained intact. In the mess that morning, the operators drank tea from enamel mugs, too tired to celebrate. Palmer read the preliminary report aloud. Enemy raid repelled before penetration of defense line. Early warning credited to Bawdsey Station. Someone raised an eyebrow. "That means us?" "Apparently," they laughed quietly. The laughter of exhaustion. 2 days later, a courier from the Air Ministry arrived with a typed note for the station commander. Commendation to Flight Lieutenant E. Palmer for exceptional vigilance resulting in successful interception of enemy low-level raid. November 1940. Palmer read it once, folded it, and tucked it into his logbook. He didn't keep medals. He kept bearings, distances, and nights when dots of light had meant the difference between survival and silence. Outside, the sea wind rattled the tower cables. He put on his headphones again. Another shift had begun. The enemy would come back, and the radar would be waiting. The winter of 1940 settled over the Suffolk coast like a heavy wool blanket. The fog clung low to the dunes. The North Sea turned iron gray, and the nights stretched on as if time itself had forgotten to move forward. But in the squat, windowless huts of Chain Home, the air was alive with electricity. The radar stations had changed everything. Each sweep of the cathode ray screens meant seconds bought for Britain, seconds that could turn disaster into defense. But to make the system truly work, it needed more than machines. It needed minds. And now, those minds were multiplying. By December, the RAF had begun bringing in more operators, many of them young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAF. Some had never even seen an oscilloscope before. Within weeks, they were reading the air like old hands. One of them, Corporal Margaret Maggie Dunn, arrived at Bawdsey on a frostbitten morning, cheeks red, uniform crisp. She was 21, from Manchester, and had studied mathematics before the war interrupted everything. Palmer met her on her first shift. She listened carefully as he explained the quirks of low-level detection, the fine difference between storm clutter and steel. Then, without blinking, she traced a faint echo with the ruler and said, "That's moving too cleanly to be weather. You've got company 20 miles east." She was right. Minutes later, the operations room confirmed a German reconnaissance plane skimming the coast. The fighters were scrambled. "The system worked, fast learner," Palmer said. "Fast teacher," she replied. The radar hut was always cold. Its thin walls were lined with wiring and equipment, its lights dimmed to make the glowing scopes visible. The operators sat on stools before their sets, headphones on, hands steady on tuning knobs. Every few seconds the green line swept the circle, bringing with it faint sparks of light. Some nothing more than noise, some bearing the weight of entire air raids. The operators learned to tell them apart not with manuals, but with instinct. The rhythm of the blip, the thickness of the echo, the tiny flutter that meant metal cutting through cloud. Maggie once joked, "You can hear them before you see them." Palmer nodded. "You can feel them before you hear them." At Bentley Priory, the Boffins, the scientists who had designed the Chain Home system, were pushing the technology further. They adjusted frequencies, added more receiving towers, and experimented with new plotting techniques. Palmer and his fellow operators were part of an invisible feedback loop. Radar intelligence in the field, filter room plotting, scientific refinement, stronger defense. Radar was no longer a novelty. It was becoming a weapon. On a snow-covered night in January 1941, the screens went strangely quiet. For weeks, the Luftwaffe had attacked in relentless waves. But that night, nothing. No blips, no murmurs. Maggie leaned back, rubbing her temples. Either they've given up, or they're waiting for something worse. At 2:07 a.m., a faint fluttering line appeared on her scope. almost lost in the noise. She narrowed the beam, tuned down the gain, and watched it sharpen. "Eddie," she whispered. "We've got something southeast, low, very low." The bearing went to Bentley Priory. Interceptors scrambled. 15 minutes later, a single Luftwaffe bomber was caught by hurricanes over the channel and shot down. No one ever knew what its target had been, but the operators at WWII did. They had seen the shadow before it became flame. By now, fatigue was an enemy as real as the Luftwaffe. Palmer's shifts stretched 12 hours, sometimes more. The room smelled of stale tea and burned dust. His eyes ached constantly. His ears rang with the endless whisper of static. Maggie once found him asleep at the console between sweeps, his head resting against the metal casing. She nudged him awake with a mug of tea. "If you fall asleep, who's going to save the country?" she said. "Maybe the country can take a shift," he muttered, smiling. But they both knew they couldn't afford to stop. There were too few operators, too many nights. As the months wore on, they began to recognize patterns in the enemy's movements. They could tell a Heinkel formation from a Junkers formation just by the way the echoes moved across the scope. Reconnaissance flights had a clean, narrow pulse. Bombing runs came in wide, staggered lines. Maggie kept a small notebook beside her console filled with sketches of echo patterns. Palmer teased her about it. "One day they'll call this classified science." "One day they'll call it history," she replied. In February 1941, a storm knocked out power to the radar station. For half an hour the screens went dark. The operators sat in the cold, listening to the wind hammering the tower outside. Without their eyes, the coast was blind. Palmer checked the backup generator, hands numb. When the lights finally flickered back to life, the first thing they saw was a raid already halfway across the channel. Fighter Command had lost valuable minutes. It was the longest half-hour of Palmer's life. That night, 2 coastal towns were bombed. It reminded everyone how fragile their miracle really was. By spring, radar stations like WWII had become the backbone of Britain's air defense. The Luftwaffe had shifted tactics. Less daytime bombing, more night raids, faster, lower, always testing the network. But the operators adapted too. They became hunters in the dark, reading the sky with their instruments. Palmer no longer thought of the screen as a tool. It was a window. Every flicker, every pulse carried lives inside it. Their job was to see what no one else could. And that invisible vigilance, the quiet war fought in dimly lit rooms, would prove just as decisive as the battles in the sky. The spring of 1941 brought no peace. The nights were shorter, but the air still smelled of smoke. London burned, ports smoldered, and the sound of engines rolled across the coast like thunder that never stopped. For the radar operators, this was the most dangerous season yet. The Germans had learned that Britain's secret weapon wasn't the Spitfire or the Hurricane. It was information, and now they were coming to blind it. In early April, reports arrived of German bombers targeting the radar towers themselves. Dover, Ventnor, Worth Matravers. They had been spotted, hit, repaired, and hit again. Chain Home was no longer invisible. At WWII, Palmer and his crew knew it was only a matter of time before the enemy came for them. The station commander briefed them calmly. "We'll maintain full operation until ordered otherwise. If they come, you stay on the set. The longer we stay online, the more warning the country has." Palmer nodded, but inside he felt the familiar tightening in his chest. For months he had watched blips move across glass. Now he would become one of them. It was near midnight on April 12th when the first sign came. A faint line of echoes, east-southeast, moving fast and low. Palmer leaned over the scope, adjusting the range. They were too small to be a main bomber group, more like a detachment. "Bearing 180, he said into the microphone. "Possible fighter-bomber formation, 10 miles off the coast." He expected the next call to go out. Fighter Command alerted, squadrons scrambled. But before the confirmation came, the lights flickered. The generator coughed once, twice, then the screens blinked out. The hut went black. Only the wind and the static from the headsets filled the void. "We've lost power again," Maggie shouted. "Not the generator, it's interference," Palmer said. They're jamming us! It was the first time he had seen it in action. The Luftwaffe had begun broadcasting powerful radio signals designed to overwhelm radar receivers. The result was chaos. The screens flooded with meaningless light. The dials screamed with noise. "Can we filter it out?" Maggie asked. "Maybe." Palmer twisted the gain control, tuned the frequency up and down in tiny steps, searching for a hole in the storm. Every few seconds the noise surged, then fell, then surged again. Through the static, faint traces appeared, ghosts beneath the chaos. "There," he said. "I can still see them." He plotted the bearing, relayed it by phone to the next station north. They confirmed similar readings. The attack was real, but the Germans had misjudged the system. The chain-home transmitters used longer wavelengths than their jammers could block. Palmer and his team simply changed frequency, found the signal again, and kept reporting. The radar was wounded, but not blind. Moments later, the anti-aircraft guns at Felixstowe opened fire. The sound shook the windows. Palmer ran outside just long enough to see the sky flashing, bright arcs of tracer fire against the dark. He ducked back inside as fragments of flak rained down on the dunes. "They're going for the tower!" a voice shouted from the doorway. The station commander's voice came through the loudspeaker, steady and calm. "Maintain watch. Keep transmitting. We must not lose contact," so they stayed at their posts. The building trembled as bombs fell nearby, the shock waves making the screens jump. The radar beam continued to sweep its circle, tracing echoes through the storm. Palmer's pencil never stopped. He marked bearings, ranges, estimated speeds, all while dust fell from the ceiling. Maggie sat beside him, adjusting the gain, keeping the signal alive. 5 miles inland, she said. "They're dropping now." They both flinched as an explosion shook the ground hard enough to rattle the glass. "That's close," Palmer muttered. "Closer than I like." Then, just as suddenly, the interference stopped. The noise vanished, the scope cleared, and for a few seconds they could see everything, the full sweep of the coastline alive with echoes. "Look at that," Maggie whispered. "It's beautiful." Dozens of blips retreated east, heading back toward the sea. The guns fell silent. The station commander's voice crackled over the intercom. "Enemy withdrawing. Damage minimal." "Well done, everyone." Palmer took off his headset, his ears ringing from the static. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly from the fires of burning fields. But the tower still stood, and the radar still worked. At dawn, the damage became clear. A bomb crater just 50 yards from the operations hut. Broken windows, some shrapnel holes in the transmitter housing. But the aerial array remained untouched. A reporter from the local paper arrived 2 days later, wanting a story. He was politely turned away. The operators went back to work as if nothing had happened. Their names wouldn't appear in print until decades later. Weeks afterward, an Air Ministry scientist visited the station. He asked Palmer and Maggie to describe the jamming, every frequency, every pattern. Their data became the foundation for Britain's next secret weapon, radar countermeasures. The Germans had tried to blind them with noise. Instead, they had taught them how to see through it. That night, as they closed the hut for the evening, Maggie looked up at the tower, its cables humming in the wind. "You ever think we'll tell anyone what we did here?" "Someday," Palmer said, "when they think the war was won by daylight." The station fell silent again, save for the hum of the machines. The radar beam turned, sweeping its eternal circle. On the screen, faint blips blinked in and out like distant stars. To anyone else, they were nothing. To Palmer, they were the heartbeat of Britain itself, steady, fragile, but unbroken. By the summer of 1941, the night sky above Britain had changed. It was no longer the clean black emptiness it once was. Now it was alive, a living map of invisible currents and radio waves, where truth and illusion danced together in an unending contest of wits. For Eddie Palmer and the operators of Chain Home, the war had evolved. The Germans no longer sent single waves of bombers. They sent decoys, false signals, and feints. They dropped metal strips. Window, the British would later call it, designed to confuse radar by scattering echoes everywhere. It was a new kind of war, a war of signals. And in this invisible battle, every second of clarity was worth 1,000 lives. It started with confusion. On the night of June 19th, Palmer's station began picking up multiple returns from the same bearing. Identical, repeating, impossible. The echoes seemed to multiply, spreading out like ripples across water. "There can't be that many aircraft," said Maggie, leaning over the scope. "It's a ghosting effect," Palmer said. "Or something worse." They checked with other stations up and down the coast. Each reported the same. 100 targets suddenly appearing out of nowhere. Fighter Command was alarmed. Squadrons were scrambled. Air raid sirens wailed across southern England. But when the Spitfires reached the coordinates, there was nothing. No aircraft, no bombs, only the empty sea. For the first time, radar itself had been tricked. The Luftwaffe had begun experimenting with radio reflectors, small metallic strips released by aircraft to create false radar images. At the time, Britain didn't yet know what caused the phenomenon. To the operators, it looked like the sky itself had fractured into mirrors. Maggie stared at the chaos on her screen. "How do you fight an enemy that isn't there?" Palmer didn't answer. He turned down the gain, adjusted the pulse width, tried to separate the real echoes from the false. The difference was subtle. A real aircraft echo moved smoothly. A false one shimmered erratically. He trained his eyes to tell the two apart. "You don't fight it," he said quietly. "You learn to see through it." Over the next weeks, the radar stations adapted. Operators developed new techniques, timing sweeps, comparing overlapping bearings, and using human intuition to filter reality from deception. They were doing what no machine could do, thinking through the noise. At Bentley Priory, intelligence officers began visiting Bawdsey more often. They wanted to know how Palmer's team managed to maintain accuracy when other stations struggled. He told them the truth. "It's not science anymore. It's instinct. We watch the way the light moves," one officer replied. "Then you're artists, not engineers." Palmer smiled faintly. "Artists with a very small canvas." On July 3rd, the Luftwaffe launched what appeared to be a massive attack on Liverpool and Bristol. Radar stations across southern England lit up with hundreds of echoes. Every screen blazed. But something was wrong. The signals weren't advancing. They hovered, shifted, disappeared. Palmer and Maggie double-checked the bearings. No sound of engines, no aircraft lights, no anti-aircraft fire reported. It was a phantom raid. The Germans had dropped thousands of strips of metal foil, enough to blind the radar network for half an hour. By dawn, the truth was clear. It was a diversion, designed to mask a smaller real raid on Hull. Chain Home had been partially fooled, but not fully, because one operator at Bawdsey, Maggie, had noticed a faint cluster of real returns hidden in the static. She passed the coordinates to Fighter Command. Hurricanes intercepted the real bombers before they reached the target. A week later, a letter arrived addressed to the Bawdsey team. It came from Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding himself. "To the radar operators of Chain Home," it read, "your continued vigilance and adaptation under unprecedented conditions have preserved our edge in the air. The enemy believes he can hide behind the noise. You have proven otherwise. It wasn't a medal, but it was better." For the first time, the invisible war was being acknowledged by the very top. Palmer pinned the letter to the wall beside the plotting chart. For the operators, it was a reminder that what they did mattered, even if no one outside knew their names. But the strain was showing. Palmer had lost 15 pounds since the Blitz began. Maggie's hands trembled when she held her mug of tea. They slept in 3-hour shifts, ate when they could, and lived in a constant state of half-alertness. Once, during a lull, Palmer confessed, "Every time I close my eyes, I still see the echoes. They move in my head like ghosts." Maggie smiled faintly. "Better ghosts than silence. Silence means they're here." As the months went on, the operators became so attuned to the rhythm of radar that they could predict the enemy's tactics before the screens even showed them. They learned the language of signals. Each pulse, each delay, each flicker told a story. A storm on the channel, a formation climbing for altitude, A single aircraft wandering home too late. The static wasn't noise anymore. It was music. Chaotic, dissonant, and terrifyingly human. On August 12th, the radar scopes lit up brighter than anyone had ever seen. Thousands of signals filled the screens. For hours, operators across Britain tried to make sense of them. Palmer's team stayed on duty for 18 straight hours, hands numb, eyes burning. By dawn, the chaos cleared. No mass invasion, no catastrophic strike, only scattered raids and lost aircraft. The Germans had thrown everything into the air to test the British response. A mock armada. It was radar's greatest trial yet, and it had survived. When the last echo faded, the operators sat in silence. Outside, gulls circled the gray sea. The sky was empty again. Palmer removed his headset and rubbed his temples. "One day," he said, "we'll miss the noise." "Not me," Maggie replied, smiling. "I'll take quiet any day." But she was wrong. The quiet would not last. In a few months the war would shift again, and radar would move from the coast to the skies themselves. Palmer didn't know it yet, but his next assignment would change how air warfare was fought forever. By September 1941, the war had stretched into its second endless year, and Britain's defense no longer rested solely on towers and static screens. The scientists in white coats, the boffins from the Telecommunications Research Establishment, had a new vision. Radar in the sky. It sounded impossible, yet so had everything else that won the Battle of Britain. Eddie Palmer received his transfer orders on a rainy morning. After nearly 2 years staring at the ghostly light of a cathode ray screen, he was to join an experimental flight unit based at RAF Defford in Worcestershire. There, radar wouldn't just look out to sea. It would look down from the clouds. When Palmer arrived, he found a small airfield filled not with sleek fighters, but with lumbering bombers and odd contraptions covered in cables and antennae. The project leader, Dr. Edward Bowen, greeted him with a grin that mixed exhaustion and pride. "Welcome to the airborne radar program," Bowen said. "We're teaching aircraft to see in the dark." Inside a converted Wellington bomber, Palmer found a compact radar set bolted to the floor. It looked like a smaller version of the chain-home consoles he knew so well. Green glow, rotating sweep, knobs for gain and range. But this one was powered by the plane's engines. Instead of looking hundreds of miles across the sea, it scanned just a few miles ahead, detecting aircraft or ships hidden in cloud and darkness. Bowen explained, "We call it airborne interception radar. It's the next evolution. If it works, our night fighters will no longer be blind." Palmer touched the control panel as if it were alive. In a way, it was. His first flight took place on October 2, 1941. The Wellington lifted off into a gray sky, the wind buffeting its wide wings. Palmer sat beside the pilot, headphones on, eyes fixed on the flickering scope. At first there was only static, then faintly a pulse. Something large ahead, moving fast. He gave the pilot a bearing correction. The plane turned slightly. The blip grew stronger. "That's an aircraft," Palmer said. "Friendly? Not unless we have a bomber formation this far east." Minutes later, searchlights from the ground caught a Heinkel bomber in their beams, exactly where the radar had said it would be. It was the first confirmed airborne radar contact of the war. Palmer's heart raced. He wasn't sitting in a hut anymore, watching the war from afar. He was inside it, part of the invisible duel playing out above the clouds. The next phase of testing involved the new Bristol Beaufighter, a twin-engine aircraft designed for night interception. Palmer worked with a squadron of pilots who were learning to fly not by sight, but by radar readings. Each flight was an act of faith, the operator guiding the pilot toward an unseen target through voice commands alone. Turn left 5 degrees. Range 2 miles. Closing. 1 mile. Half a mile. Then, out of nowhere, the target would appear, just a dark silhouette against a darker sky. Machine guns flashed, engines roared, and the echo on the screen vanished. The pilots called it blind hunting. Palmer called it science with wings. Among the new pilots was squadron leader Arthur Ellison, a calm, deliberate man whose voice never rose above a steady murmur. During one night flight while hunting a formation over the Bristol Channel, Ellison's voice came through Palmer's headset. "You know, Eddie," he said, "you people on the ground kept us alive. We never saw your faces, we just heard the bearings. But you were always there." Palmer smiled. "Now it's my turn to return the favor." Ellison chuckled. "Let's make sure we both come back." They did. Barely. That night they encountered flak over Cherbourg, and the Beaufighter came home with holes in the fuselage. But the radar had worked flawlessly. The radar team refined their techniques with every mission. They learned how rain distorted readings, how mountains caused false echoes, and how enemy aircraft could be identified by the rhythm of their pulse reflections. Palmer filled notebooks with sketches and notes. To him, each blip was no longer abstract. It was a heartbeat, a presence in the dark. He sometimes wondered if the German crews ever imagined that somewhere, someone was tracing their lives across a glowing circle. They never saw each other, yet they were connected, by signals, by war, by fate. One December night, Ellison's Beaufighter failed to return. The radar had shown a perfect intercept. Then the echo disappeared, followed by silence. Palmer waited in the operations hut for hours, staring at the empty sky. He later learned that Ellison's plane had been hit over the channel. Both crewmen lost. For the first time since the war began, Palmer felt the weight of his own invention. He had given men sight in the dark and sent them into it. The thought haunted him for weeks. By early 1942, the airborne radar program had become operational. Every night fighter in Britain carried a small version of Palmer's set. Chainholm still watched the coast, but now its warning passed to the pilots who could strike unseen. It was the dawn of a new era, the electronic battlefield. The sky was no longer blind. Palmer returned to Bawdsey briefly that spring. The old tower still stood, cables humming, screens glowing softly. Maggie was still there, calm and sharp as ever. "You look different," she said. "I've seen the other side of the signal," he replied. "And?" "It looks just like this, only louder." They shared a smile, knowing they'd both survived a world most people would never understand. The first operational kill by airborne radar came soon after, recorded by a Beaufighter crew guided entirely by Palmer's technology. That night, as London slept, a new kind of warfare was born, a war of waves and echoes, fought by men and women who never saw their enemies, yet held their fates in the glow of a cathode ray. Palmer wrote one line in his logbook that night: "The sky listens now." By the winter of 1942, the war had entered a new dimension, one made of light no human could see. Radar was no longer Britain's secret advantage. It was the foundation of a new kind of combat, a world where physics and psychology intertwined. Every strike, every counterstrike, began not with gunfire, but with a pulse of energy. And in that invisible theater, Eddie Palmer found himself watching a revolution he had helped start, and could no longer control. The Germans had learned quickly. Captured British radar components, downed aircraft, and intelligence leaks had given them enough clues to begin building their own systems. They called them Liechtenstein and Freya. Airborne and ground-based radars that mirrored Britain's Chainholm and AI sets. Soon, German night fighters prowled the skies guided by their own invisible eyes. The battle for air supremacy had become a duel of frequencies. Whoever saw first lived. Palmer now worked in London, at the newly established Air Ministry's Signals Development Unit, analyzing intercepted German radar transmissions. He spent long nights listening to faint beeps and bursts of static, mapping the enemy's electronic pulse like a doctor studying a heartbeat. "They've learned our rhythm," he told Maggie during one of her visits. "Then we change the rhythm," she said. The British response came in the form of deception. Codenamed Window, the same metallic strips that had once confused British radar were now deployed by the RAF over German cities. Thousands of strips of aluminum foil fluttered through the night, scattering reflections across enemy scopes until their screens turned to snow. It was the perfect irony. What had once nearly blinded Chainholm now blinded the Luftwaffe instead. Palmer watched the first reports come in from Hamburg and Cologne. Enemy radar rooms paralyzed, night fighters circling blindly, bombers reaching targets untouched. He should have been elated, but the victory felt hollow. For every signal gained, another was lost. For every advantage built, a countermeasure followed. It was as if the war itself had gone invisible, reduced to mathematics and waveforms. In February 1943, Palmer visited an airfield in Lincolnshire to inspect the new AI Mech-weight radar installed in a Lancaster bomber. The crew greeted him warmly, boys no older than 21, grinning, joking, unaware that half of them would never see another spring. That night they flew a demonstration sortie. Palmer stood on the runway, headphones pressed to his ears, listening to the transmission chatter as the bomber climbed into the mist. An hour later, static filled the channel. Then nothing. The plane vanished from radar, British and German alike. It was never found. Palmer stared at the empty scope, the same way he had years ago at WWII, when he first learned to see ghosts in the green light. He realized that radar could reveal almost anything, except what happened to the men it guided. By mid-1943, both sides were engaged in what the intelligence officers called the cat-and-mouse war. Every new radar frequency the British deployed, the Germans countered. Every German beam, Britain jammed or bent back upon itself. It was a scientific arms race fought in secret, and Palmer was now one of its senior analysts. He often worked alongside scientists from the telecommunications research establishment, physicists who thought in equations, not in emotions. But for him, the war had always been human. "They talk about range and resolution," he wrote in his diary, "but I still see faces every time the echo fades." One night in December, a captured German radar set arrived at the lab. Palmer spent hours taking it apart, tracing the circuits, reading the German labels burned into the metal. Empfänger, Sender, Verstärker. It was crude compared to British designs, but deadly in its simplicity. He realized, with a cold kind of awe, that somewhere in occupied Europe there was a man just like him, sitting in a dark room, listening to pulses, guiding his own country's defenses, probably believing the same thing Palmer did, that he was saving lives. They were reflections of each other, echoes across nations. By early 1943, radar had tipped the balance of the war. Convoys, once slaughtered by U-boats, now crossed the Atlantic with new centimetric radar, able to spot submarines even in total darkness. The skies over Britain were safer, the coasts more secure. But for Palmer, the thrill was gone. The work had become mechanical. Endless adjustments, endless waves. He began teaching new recruits, passing on what he'd learned about reading the invisible. They were younger, faster, more eager. He saw himself in them, and hoped they'd never feel the same exhaustion that haunted him. That spring, after nearly 3 years away, Palmer returned once more to WWII. The station was quieter now. The towers still stood, weathered and humming. Maggie was still there, running the control room with quiet authority. They walked along the beach together, listening to the gulls and the soft crash of waves. "Do you ever miss the noise?" she asked. "Sometimes," Palmer admitted. "It was the sound of knowing what was coming. And now? Now I just hope what's coming is peace." They stood for a while looking out to sea. Somewhere beyond that gray horizon, ships carried radar sets that would soon help invade Europe. The end of the war was coming, and the next beginning. When Palmer returned to London, he received a classified memo marked "Most Secret." It confirmed what everyone in Radar Command already knew. The electronic war had turned. The Luftwaffe's night fighter network was collapsing under the weight of Allied countermeasures. Chain Home, once a desperate experiment, had become the backbone of an empire of signals stretching from Britain to Africa, from the Atlantic to the Arctic Circle. For the first time since 1939, Palmer slept through an entire night without dreaming of echoes. In his final wartime report, he wrote a line that no superior ever noticed. "We have given mankind a new way to see. But what we see first is destruction." He sealed the report, signed it, and turned off the lamp. Outside, London's sky glowed faintly from distant searchlights. Not from fear this time, but from vigilance. The blind could see now, and no one could ever close their eyes again. The end came quietly. No explosions, no sirens, just silence. After 6 years of unending noise, the war in Europe ended with a whisper. On the morning of May 8, 1945, the air over Britain was still. No bombers, no searchlights, only the cry of gulls and the slow hum of the wind through the empty towers of Chain Home. Eddie Palmer stood on the cliff top outside Bawdsey, staring at the horizon he had watched for half a decade. He could still picture the ghosts, the arcs of blips, the rhythmic glow of the scopes, the night sky pulsing with unseen energy. It all felt impossibly distant now, like a dream too vivid to fade, yet too painful to remember. The radar stations that had once guarded the nation were shutting down one by one. The operators, men and women who had lived half their lives in darkness, were going home, some to cities bombed beyond recognition, some to families who never knew what they had done. There were no parades for the people of Chain Home, no medals for the eyes that never closed. Palmer walked through the operations hut for the last time. The screens were dark, the hum of electricity gone. Only the faint smell of dust and solder remained. On the wall still hung Dowding's letter from years before, the one praising their vigilance. He ran a finger over the paper, now yellowed at the edges. Then he switched off the main circuit breaker. The lights died, and with them, the sound of the war's heartbeat. In London, Palmer was invited to a debriefing at the Air Ministry. The officials spoke in calm, bureaucratic tones. They discussed data, frequencies, performance metrics, as if the war had been fought in numbers. But behind every statistic, Palmer saw the faces of the operators he'd trained, the pilots he'd guided, the friends he'd lost. When his turn came to speak, he simply said, "Radar didn't win the war. People did. We only gave them time." There was a pause. Someone scribbled it down. Then the meeting moved on. After the war, scientists reclaimed radar from the military. It was reborn as navigation for ships, guidance for airliners, and the invisible skeleton of civil aviation. No longer an instrument of survival, it became one of exploration. Palmer was asked to join the Civil Radar Research Board, helping adapt wartime systems for peacetime use. He accepted, though part of him feared what peace would feel like without purpose. Maggie joined too. She worked on weather detection, turning what had once warned of bombers into a tool for predicting storms. When they reunited in 1946 at a conference in Cambridge, she smiled and said, "Still staring at screens? Still seeing ghosts," he replied. But the ghosts were changing. They were ships, planes, rain clouds, not enemies. For the first time, radar was looking at life instead of death. One summer afternoon, Palmer returned to Bawdsey. The base was abandoned, grass growing between the concrete pads, rust crawling up the tower legs. He stood beneath the steel lattice that had once held Britain's fate. The cables were gone, the antennas dismantled. But if he closed his eyes, he could still hear it. The hum of current, the crackle of static, the steady rhythm of 1,000 unseen hearts. He remembered. The night in November 1940, when he had first seen those faint echoes approaching, the raid that never reached its target because he had caught it in time, the night that defined his life. It struck him how fragile it all was, how history hinged on invisible pulses and unseen hands. Palmer began writing a book, part memoir, part technical manual, about the evolution of radar. He never finished it. The words came too heavily, as if he feared translating ghosts into ink. Instead, he wrote letters to the families of operators he'd known, to scientists he admired, to Maggie when she was away on assignment. In one of them, he wrote, "The miracle of radar was not that it saw through darkness. It was that ordinary people learned to trust what they could not see." Maggie kept that letter for the rest of her life. It took decades for the story of Chain Home to become public. For years after the war, the operators were bound by secrecy. Even when the towers rusted into silence, their work remained classified. Then, in 1975, the government declassified the radar archives. The newspapers ran headlines. Britain's secret eyes revealed. Television documentaries followed. Suddenly, the quiet men and women who had saved a nation from the shadows became heroes. Palmer was interviewed by the BBC. He sat in his small cottage, surrounded by old logbooks and photographs. When the reporter asked him what radar had meant to him, he paused for a long moment before answering. "It meant hope," he said. Every echo meant someone still had a chance. In 1978, at the age of 62, Palmer returned once more to the coast. The radar towers were gone now, dismantled years before. Only their concrete bases remained, half buried in sand and grass. He carried a small portable radio. At sunset, he turned it on and listened to the soft hiss of static. It was a meaningless sound to most, but to him it was home. The echo of a lifetime spent listening to the invisible. The wind rose, carrying the faint scent of salt. He closed his eyes. For a moment he could almost hear the voice of Maggie beside him, steady and calm. "Bearing 180. Range 40 miles, he smiled. The ghosts were still there, not haunting him, but keeping watch. Today, radar lives everywhere, in every aircraft, every ship, every storm forecast. It is the silent guardian of modern life, tracing the movement of weather, of planes, of time itself. Few remember the names of the people who first made it possible, those who stared into flickering circles of light and believed what they saw. But every pulse, every echo, carries a fragment of their story. The war they fought was not only for survival, but for vision. And though the towers have fallen, their signal still moves through the air. Infinite, invisible, eternal. The sky listens now. Flight Lieutenant Edward Palmer.